She didn't bark for help. She didn't whine. In the middle of a brutal winter storm, a mother dog stood at a stranger's door carrying what little life she had left. Her puppies were fading one by one, and time was running out. Inside that quiet cabin lived a retired SWAT officer who believed his days of saving anyone were long over. But that night, with snow burying the world outside, he had to make a single choice: open the door or live with what he would lose forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived in Montana without warning, not like a visitor, but like a force that erased sound, color, and certainty, burying the world under cold and silence. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and relentless, swallowing the pine trees one by one, until the forest beyond the windows of the cabin looked like a blurred memory rather than a place. The wind pressed against the wooden walls with a low, steady howl, the kind that didn't rage but endured, testing what was weak and waiting for it to give in. John Miller sat alone at the small oak table near the fireplace, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. At 63, his body no longer obeyed him the way it once had. His knees ached when the weather shifted, a deep grinding pain that lived beneath the bone, and his right shoulder carried a stiffness that never fully faded, no matter how much he stretched or rubbed it. John was a large man. Still, even with age thinning him slightly. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, his frame wide and solid, built during decades when strength had been less a choice and more a requirement. His hair, once dark brown, was now mostly gray, cut short out of habit rather than style. A trimmed beard covered his jaw, salt and pepper and coarse, framing a face marked by deep lines around the eyes and mouth. Those lines weren't from laughter. They came from years of narrowing his focus, from scanning rooms and doorways, from decisions made in seconds that carried weight long after the noise stopped. His eyes were steel blue, sharp despite the fatigue that dulled them lately. People used to say there was something unsettling about John Miller's stare, not because it was aggressive, but because it was steady. When he looked at you, he didn't look away. He assessed. He waited. That habit had kept him alive through 27 years as a SWAT officer, through hostage situations, drug, raids, barricaded suspects, and scenes that never made the news. Retirement hadn't softened him the way people expected. It had hollowed him out. Across the room, Margaret Miller moved slowly from the kitchen counter to the sink, her footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. She was 61, slender, with a posture that carried both grace and fatigue. Her hair, once a warm chestnut brown, had faded into a soft silver she wore just past her shoulders, usually tied back in a loose knot. Fine lines traced her face, especially around her eyes, but there was a gentleness there that never faded, a steadiness John had leaned on more times than he could count. Margaret had been a librarian before retirement, a woman who believed in order, patience, and the quiet power of words. She had married John, knowing the job would always come first, and she had endured the late-night calls, the sudden silences, the tension that followed him home like a shadow. She never asked what he saw on the job. She didn't need to. She learned to read it in his shoulders, in the way his hands clenched when a door slammed too hard, in how he woke from sleep gasping as if the air itself had betrayed him. They spoke little that night. They had learned over the years that silence was not absence. It was a language of its own. John stared into the fire, watching the flames curl and collapse over and over again. The crackle of burning wood was familiar, comforting in its predictability. Fire behaved by rules. People didn't. He thought, not for the first time, that retirement had stripped him of structure. No radio calls, no team, no missions, just long days filled with maintenance and memories he couldn't outrun. A sudden sound cut through the storm, not the wind, not the creak of old beams settling. A short, uneven bark. John's spine straightened instantly, his grip tightened on the mug, knuckles whitening. The years fell away in a heartbeat, replaced by instinct sharpened. Through repetition. His breathing slowed, his hearing focused. Another sound followed, softer this time. A scrape. Margaret looked up. Did you hear that?" John didn't answer. He was already standing, moving toward the door with deliberate calm. His joints protested, but he ignored them. Pain was familiar. Fear, he told himself, was not. He reached the front door and rested his hand against the wood, feeling the cold seep through it. For a brief moment, he hesitated, an old, unwelcome memory flickering through his mind of doors kicked open and the chaos that followed. Then he opened it. The wind surged inside, scattering snow across the floor like white ash. The porch light illuminated a figure standing just beyond the threshold, a German shepherd. She was large but painfully thin, her black and tan coat dulled by snow and exhaustion. Ice clung to the fur around her legs and chest. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her coat, rising and falling with each breath. One ear stood upright, the other tipped slightly forward, giving her a perpetually alert expression. Her amber eyes were locked on John's, steady and unblinking. She did not bark. She did not growl. She stood there, rigid but calm, as if rooted to the porch boards. In her mouth, she carried something small, wrapped awkwardly in her jaw. John's eyes adjusted, his chest tightening as he realized what it was. A puppy. The tiny body hung limp, its paws dangling, breath shallow but visible in the cold air. John felt something twist deep in his chest, something sharp and unwelcome. He crouched slowly, keeping his movements measured. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't retreat. She didn't advance either. She simply waited. Margaret appeared behind him, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. The German shepherd took a cautious step forward, just enough for the porch light to catch her face fully. Up close, John could see the scars. Beneath her fur, thin white lines along her flank and shoulder, signs of a hard life. She was not young. He guessed 5, maybe 6 years old. Her body carried the tension of a creature that had learned survival the hard way. "What do you think she wants?" Margaret asked softly. John didn't answer. He already knew. He stepped back and opened the door wider. The dog hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly past him, scanning the interior, the fire, the warmth. Then she crossed the threshold. Her paws left dark, wet prints on the floor as she moved to the edge of the hearth and gently lowered the puppy onto the rug. She sniffed it once, then turned and walked back toward the door. John stared at her, understanding dawning slowly, heavily. She was going back into the storm. "Wait," he said, the words slipping out before he thought better of it. The dog paused, looking back at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "John," Margaret said, her voice tight, "she's not done." He nodded once. He knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors, in teammates' faces, in men who went back into danger because stopping wasn't an option. "Go," he said quietly, holding the door open. The German shepherd vanished into the snow. John stood there long after, the cold brushing his skin, the fire crackling behind him, his heart pounding with a familiar, unwelcome rhythm. For the first time in years, winter hadn't just arrived. It had brought something with it. And John Miller knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that whatever this night demanded, it wasn't finished yet. Morning came without sunlight. The storm had loosened its grip but not released it, leaving the world buried under a pale, unmoving sheet of snow that reflected the sky like dull glass. John Miller stood just inside the open barn door, breath fogging the air, staring down at the tracks pressed deep into the white. They were fresh. Large paw prints led away from the barn in a narrow line, cutting toward the tree line behind the house. John crouched slowly, ignoring the sharp protest in his knees, and brushed away a layer of powder with his gloved hand. The impressions were uneven, deeper in places, staggered in others. Whoever made them was moving under strain. "She went back out," Margaret said quietly behind him. She had wrapped herself in a thick wool sweater, her arms crossed against the cold. Her voice carried concern, but no surprise. John nodded once. He had expected this. Faith had not crossed their threshold to stay. She had come to deliver something precious and then return to whatever waited for her beyond the light. He straightened with effort, a faint grimace crossing his face as his joints locked and released. "I'm going to see where she went," he said. Margaret stepped closer, placing a hand against his arm. "John, the snow's still deep, and your knee—" "I know," he replied, softer than he meant to. "I won't go far." That was a lie, and they both knew it. But Margaret also knew the look in his eyes, the same one he'd worn every time he'd left the house in the dark years ago when the radio crackled and someone else's worst night became his responsibility. She nodded slowly and squeezed his arm once before letting go. John followed the tracks into the forest, each step sinking calf-deep into the snow. The woods were silent in the way only winter forests could be, sounds swallowed by cold and distance. The trees stood tall and bare-limbed, their branches bowed under the weight of ice. The farther he went, the sharper the pain in his knee became, a hot, grinding reminder of age and limits. He paused once, bracing himself against a trunk, breathing through it. "You can turn back," a voice whispered in his mind. He ignored it. The tracks began to change, spreading, overlapping. Smaller prints appeared alongside the larger ones, uneven and shallow. John's chest tightened. He moved faster despite the ache, heart pounding now, not from exertion alone. The trail led down a slight incline toward a low ridge where fallen trees had piled up over the years, creating a tangle of roots and broken branches. That was where he saw her. Faith stood atop the mound, her body tense, head low, ears alert. Snow clung to her muzzle and chest. She did not bark when she saw John. She didn't run either. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing what lay beneath. A shallow den carved into the earth between roots and rocks, its entrance half collapsed under packed snow and ice. Inside, John could see movement. Small, weak, trembling shapes pressed together for warmth. "Jesus," he breathed. He dropped to one knee despite the pain and brushed away snow with his hands. The cold burned his fingers through the gloves. One puppy lay near the edge, unmoving. Its body was stiff, eyes closed, fur already dusted white. John swallowed hard. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He had seen enough death to recognize it instantly. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words meant for no one and everyone. Faith lowered her head, letting out a soft, broken sound that barely qualified as a whine. She nudged one of the living pups closer to the others, her movements careful, precise. There was no panic in her, only exhaustion and determination stretched thin. The remaining puppies were alive, but barely. Their breathing was shallow, their bodies too still. John counted quickly. Fewer than he had hoped. His throat tightened again. This was the part he hated. The counting, the assessment, the quiet realization that time had already taken what it would. "I'm here," he said aloud, more firmly now. "I'm not leaving you." He shrugged off his coat and spread it gently beside the den. His hands moved on instinct, years of training guiding him even now. He scooped up the smallest pup first, cradling it against his chest, feeling the faint flutter of a heartbeat beneath his palm. Faith watched closely, her amber eyes never leaving his hands. She didn't challenge him. She didn't flinch. She trusted him, or perhaps she simply had no strength left to doubt. "One at a time," John whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring. The climb back was slow and brutal. His knees screamed with every step uphill, the weight of the puppies pressed against him, fragile heat seeping through his shirt. He stopped twice to rest, leaning heavily on a branch, breath coming hard. Each time, Faith circled him, staying close, her body brushing his leg as if to steady him. By the time the barn came into view, John's hands were shaking. Margaret was already there, the door thrown open, her face pale beneath the gray sky. "Oh, John," she said when she saw his arms. "Get blankets," he said, voice tight. "Warm ones." They worked in silence, urgency filling the space where words would only slow them down. Margaret knelt beside him, laying out towels near the small heater they kept for tools. Faith followed, collapsing onto the straw with a heavy sigh, her sides heaving. She licked each pup as John placed them down, her tongue rough but gentle, counting them in her own way. One spot remained empty. John stood back, hands on his knees, staring at the space where another life should have been. The familiar weight settled in his chest, old and unwelcome. Too late. Again, he closed his eyes briefly, forcing the thought away before it could take root. "We saved who we could," Margaret said softly, her hand finding his shoulder. John nodded, though the words felt thin. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the sound of branches cracking under ice. Faith lifted her head at the noise, ears pricking, then relaxed again when nothing followed. She lay down fully now, curling around her litter, her body a barrier against the cold. John watched her for a long moment. In her stillness, he saw something achingly familiar, the way she held herself between danger and those who depended on her, the way exhaustion did not excuse retreat. Faith hadn't come alone, he realized. She had brought him back into a fight he thought he was done with, and this time, he didn't turn away. The storm didn't return with fury. It returned with patience. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate sheets, as if the mountain had decided to wait them out instead of breaking them outright. By afternoon, the world beyond the barn was erased again, fence posts vanishing, trees dissolving into gray silhouettes. The silence pressed in heavier than the cold. Inside the barn, heat hummed weakly from the old space heater. John Miller sat on a wooden crate, elbows braced on his knees, watching Faith in her litter with an intensity that bordered on vigilance. His coat lay discarded on the floor, damp and stiff. His hands were raw, knuckles cracked from cold and effort, but he barely noticed. Pain had become background noise. Faith lay curled tightly around her puppies, her body forming a living wall. Up close, the toll on her was unmistakable. Her flanks rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her fur, once thick and proud, lay matted along her ribs. A faint tremor ran through her hind legs when she shifted. She lifted her head at every small sound, ears twitching, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "She hasn't slept," Margaret said quietly. She stood near the door, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face pale. The flush that usually warmed her cheeks was gone, replaced by a faint grayness that made John glance at her more than once. Her movements were slower than usual, careful, as if conserving energy she didn't quite have. "She won't," John replied. "Not yet." Margaret nodded. She understood vigilance. She had lived beside it for most of her adult life. By evening, the temperature dropped sharply. The heater struggled, its fan whining in protest. John added more blankets, layering them around the puppies, careful not to smother them. One of the pups let out a thin, reedy cry, barely more than a breath. Faith responded instantly, nudging it closer, licking its head with slow, deliberate strokes. John felt his jaw tighten. The smallest one was fading. He crouched beside the heater, rubbing his hands together before reaching out. He hesitated, watching Faith's face. Her eyes met his. There was no warning in them, no challenge, only awareness. "Easy," he murmured. He touched the puppy gently, his large fingers dwarfing its tiny body. It was cold. Too cold. He had felt this before, decades ago, pressing fingers to a man's neck in an alley, waiting for a pulse that never came. The memory surged unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. Not again, he thought. He scooped the pup up and held it against his chest, inside his shirt, skin to skin. His heartbeat thudded loud in his ears. He breathed slowly, evenly, the way he had been trained, forcing calm into his body so it could travel outward. Faith watched him the entire time, her body tense but unmoving. "John," Margaret said softly. "I know," he replied. "I've got her." That night blurred into fragments. Snow thickened outside, piling against the barn doors. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. John didn't sit down. He paced, then stood, then leaned against the wall when his knee threatened to buckle. He fed the puppy tiny drops of warmed milk from a syringe Margaret had found in the old first aid kit. Each swallow a small victory. Margaret began coughing sometime after midnight. At first, she waved it off, insisting it was nothing, but John noticed the tremor in her hands when she poured water. He guided her to a chair, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You need to rest," he said. "So do you," she countered weakly. He almost laughed at that. Faith shifted again, adjusting her position to keep the rest of the litter warm. One pup twitched in its sleep, another whimpered, then settled. The smallest one, the one pressed against John's chest earlier, breathed shallowly but steadily now. Around dawn, John finally sank down beside the heater, his back against the wall, exhaustion crashing into him all at once. His head tipped back. For a moment, the barn felt like another outpost, another long night waiting for something to break. He closed his eyes and saw flashes of fluorescent lights, of blood on concrete, of faces he couldn't save no matter how fast he moved. He opened his eyes again, breath hitching. Faith was standing. She had risen silently and now faced him, her body rigid, her gaze locked onto his. In her mouth, she held the smallest puppy. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and placed it at his feet. The gesture hit him like a blow. It was unmistakable. Trust, transfer, responsibility. He had seen it before on battlefields and back alleys, the unspoken handoff that said, "I can't do this alone anymore." John swallowed hard and knelt. "Okay," he whispered, "I've got her." Margaret watched from her chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. John lifted the puppy again, wrapping it in warm cloth, holding it close. Felt the faint pulse beneath his thumb, fragile but present. He rocked slightly, unconsciously, the way Margaret used to rock bookshelves after long days, the way people rocked when there was nothing else left to do. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. Snow slowed, the wind dropping to a whisper. Pale light crept through the cracks in the barn walls, soft and uncertain. Faith lay down again, this time closer to John than before. Her head rested briefly against his knee. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it rooted him in the moment more firmly than any memory ever had. For the first time since he'd retired, John didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like he was holding the line, and he stayed that way through the morning, through the ache, through the quiet battle no one else could see. The storm loosened its grip the way exhaustion loosens a fist, slowly and without apology. By late morning, the sky above the barn thinned from iron gray to a washed-out white, and the wind fell quiet enough that sound began to return in fragments, the creak of wood, the soft breathing of animals, the distant crack of ice shifting in the trees. John Miller stood near the open barn door, testing the air like a man who had learned never to trust silence too quickly. His body felt heavy, every joint stiff from the night before. He rolled his shoulders once, winced, then looked back toward the heater where Faith lay curled around her litter. The smallest puppy was still breathing. That alone felt like a victory he hadn't earned, only been allowed to keep. Margaret slept on a narrow cot they had dragged in from the house, bundled beneath layers of blankets. Her breathing was shallow but steady, a faint rasp lingering at the edge of each inhale. John watched her longer than he meant to, guilt settling in his chest. He had promised himself years ago that no job, no mission would ever come before her again. Yet here they were, the world narrowed to survival, lines blurred. A sound cut through the quiet. An engine. John froze. His hand moved instinctively toward a place where a weapon used to be. He forced it down, heart thudding. The sound grew louder, uneven, straining against the snow-packed road. A pickup truck emerged slowly from the tree line, its tires fighting for purchase. The truck lurched, stalled, then crawled forward again. It was old, dark green, the paint dulled by years of weather. When it finally stopped near the barn, the engine coughed once and went silent. The driver's door opened. Robert Hayes stepped out, boots sinking deep into the snow. He was a big man, broad like John but heavier now, his frame thickened by age rather than muscle alone. A gray beard covered his jaw, fuller and less disciplined than John's, and his hair, what remained of it, was cropped short beneath a wool cap pulled low. His face was red from the cold, his eyes narrowed against the light, but when he spotted John, they softened immediately. "Damn it, Miller," Robert called, his voice rough but familiar. "You always did pick the worst weather to disappear." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Took you long enough," he replied. They stood there for a moment, staring at each other across the snow, two men who had once trusted each other with their lives. Robert had been John's partner on the SWAT team for nearly a decade. Where John was quiet and controlled, Robert had been loud, impatient, quick to anger, and quicker to laugh. A bad call years back, one that ended with a civilian injured and Robert taking the blame, had changed him. He'd left the force not long after, carrying a bitterness he never quite shed. "What the hell happened?" Robert asked as he trudged closer, his gaze sweeping the barn. John turned slightly, revealing Faith and the puppies behind him. Robert stopped short. His expression shifted, something hard loosening in his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Inside the barn, warmth wrapped around them again. Robert shrugged off his coat, revealing a thick flannel stretched across his shoulders. He knelt near the heater without being asked, inspecting the setup with a critical eye. "You kept them alive with this?" he asked. So far, John said. Robert nodded once. Stubborn bastard, same as always. Margaret stirred at the sound of voices. When she opened her eyes and saw Robert, she smiled weakly. I thought I heard trouble, she said. Only the usual, Robert replied gently. His voice softened with her in a way it never did with anyone else. You look like hell, Maggie, she chuckled faintly. You always had a way with compliments. Robert had brought supplies, a portable generator strapped into the truck bed, extra fuel, medical kits scavenged from a volunteer rescue unit he'd been helping since leaving the force. He moved with purpose now, anger replaced by focus. John recognized the shift instantly. Some instincts never died. They worked together without speaking much. The generator hummed to life, steady and reliable. The heater strengthened. The barn warmed inch by inch. Faith lifted her head, watching the stranger carefully. But she didn't retreat. When Robert reached out too quickly, she stiffened. John shook his head slightly. Slow, he said. Robert adjusted immediately, lowering his hand, turning his body sideways. Hey, girl, he murmured, voice calm. Didn't mean to rush you. Faith studied him for a long moment, then returned her attention to the puppies. By afternoon, Margaret's color improved. She sat up, sipping warm broth Robert had heated on a small camping stove. John felt tension drain from his chest in increments he hadn't known were there. Later, when the worst of the work was done, John and Robert stood outside, watching clouds drift slowly apart overhead. You could have called, Robert said quietly. John shook his head. Didn't think I deserved the help. Robert snorted. You never were good at knowing when to stop carrying things alone. They stood in silence for a while. She trusts you, Robert said, nodding toward Faith. John looked back at the barn. Faith lay calm now, the puppies pressed close. I think, he said slowly, she didn't have a choice. Robert glanced at him. Neither did you. The sun dipped low, casting pale light across the snow. For the first time since winter arrived, John felt something shift. Not relief, not peace, something quieter. The knowledge that holding the line didn't always mean standing alone. Inside the barn, Faith slept. The puppies breathed. Margaret rested. And outside, two old partners stood shoulder to shoulder again, not as officers, but as men who had finally learned when to let someone else step in. Winter did not end all at once. It loosened slowly, like a breath finally released after being held too long. The snow still lay thick across the land, but the air changed. It carried less threat now, more space. John Miller noticed it first when he stepped outside the barn just after dawn and didn't feel the urge to brace himself. The generator hummed steadily behind him. Smoke curled from the chimney of the house, thin and calm. For the first time in days, nothing felt like it was about to collapse. Inside the barn, Faith lay awake, her head resting on her paws, amber eyes tracking John as he entered. Her posture had changed. The tight coil of vigilance had eased. She was still alert, still guarding, but the edge was gone. The puppies squirmed against her belly, their movements stronger now, more insistent. One of them let out a sharp, indignant squeak that echoed off the wooden walls. John smiled before he realized he was doing it. Margaret joined him a moment later. Wrapped in a thick sweater, color returned to her cheeks. She leaned lightly against the doorframe, watching the scene with quiet wonder. They sound louder today, she said. They're warmer, John replied, and hungry. Faith lifted her head at the sound of Margaret's voice and wagged her tail once, slow and cautious. It wasn't submission, it wasn't affection, it was acknowledgement. The days that followed settled into a rhythm John hadn't felt in years. Feedings, cleaning, checking the generator, resting when his body demanded it instead of ignoring the signal. Robert came and went, hauling supplies, clearing snow, never overstaying. He understood boundaries. He always had, even when anger used to make him forget them. On the third day, the road reopened. A volunteer rescue unit arrived just after noon, their truck bright against the white landscape. The woman who stepped out first introduced herself simply as Claire Thompson. She was in her late 40s, medium height, bundled in layers, her dark hair braided tightly down her back. Her face bore the calm competence of someone who had seen suffering and learned not to flinch. She moved slowly when she approached Faith, crouching, letting the dog see her hands. You did good, girl, she said softly. Faith didn't retreat. She watched, then glanced back at John, as if checking the space behind her. John stayed where he was. He had learned not to rush trust. The rescue team examined the puppies one by one. Healthy, they said. Undernourished but strong. Survivors. One of them would need extra care, the smallest, but nothing they couldn't manage. John felt the familiar tightening in his chest as the crates were set down. Endings always felt like losses to him, even the good ones. He crouched beside Faith as Claire explained the process, her voice calm and respectful. "She can come with us," Claire said, "or she can stay." Faith didn't hesitate. She stepped closer to John, her shoulder brushing his knee. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I think she's chosen," she said. John swallowed. He rested a hand on Faith's back, feeling warmth and solid muscle beneath his palm. "You don't owe us anything," he murmured. Faith looked up at him. If dogs could speak, he thought, she would have laughed at the idea. The puppies were loaded carefully, their small sounds fading as the truck doors closed. Faith stood still, watching, not pacing, not whining. When the engine started, she turned away first, pressing against John's leg. Later that afternoon, when the rescue vehicles disappeared down the road, the quiet returned. But it was different now. It didn't press in. It opened outward. John sat on the porch steps, Faith beside him, her head resting on his thigh. Margaret brought 2 mugs of coffee and sat on the step above them, close enough that John could feel her presence without looking. "You're different," she said after a while. He considered that. "I don't feel finished anymore," he replied. That night, as snow fell lightly again, John nailed a small wooden sign above the barn door. The letters were uneven, carved slowly with a pocket knife that had once been standard issue. Winter Shelter. Faith found us here. Margaret watched him work, her eyes bright. Robert stood back, hands in his pockets, nodding once. Spring would take its time, they all knew that. But winter had broken its hold. And John Miller, former SWAT officer, no longer measured his worth by what he had failed to save. Faith curled at his feet as the fire burned low. For the first time in a long while, John let himself believe that some missions didn't end in loss, some ended in home. This story reminds us that strength isn't measured by how much pain we can carry alone, but by whether we are willing to open the door when life asks us to care again. Like John, many of us believe our best days are behind us, that past failures define what we deserve next. But sometimes purpose returns quietly through responsibility, compassion, and the courage to protect something smaller than ourselves. In everyday life, that might look like helping when it's inconvenient, staying when it would be easier to walk away, or choosing kindness even when we feel tired and unfinished. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs. Leave a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching.